Welcome to this episode of Coffee Science for CoffeePreneurs, where we will dive into another subject from research design that was never mentioned in the previous series episode, the theory of science, research design, and statistics. I'm Morten Münchow, and today we are exploring an exciting topic that is an extension of what we have been doing earlier in this podcast in research design and statistics. And this time we're looking into something called the evidence hierarchy. The evidence hierarchy is a valuable model for understanding the relationship between expert experience, observation, and subsequent scientific scrutiny. If applied correctly, it will revolutionize our education systems and collaboration with research institutions in our specialty coffee business, which, to my big surprise, hardly exists and it seems bureaucracy and politics has captured our community. And as always, in Coffee Mind, we pride ourselves on not inventing anything. Our mission is to bring the best of what has already been developed over the last 2,000 years in science to the specialty coffee community. To the listeners listening to this before World of Coffee in Copenhagen in June 2024, please make sure to not miss out on the free seminars we'll do in room 6, hall B, if you are there, or tune in on the live stream of these seminars. To attend, please go to our website and pick either a free on-site ticket or a free virtual ticket, where we will discuss in-depth topics like how to start a roastery, cupping form confusion, rate of rise irrelevance and what to do instead, as well as the irrelevance of organic acids in coffee tastings, as well as how to improve your sensory skills. All topics where we have done actual scientific research that backs it up. So consider this podcast a behind-the-scenes research community as topics like the above are explored. We have recorded all seminars, so if you listen to this after World of Coffee 2024, you can find the lectures on our YouTube channel. Go to our website and register for free and find the seminars on YouTube where you can get deeper insight into these topics. Just a little reservation on what is to come in this podcast episode. Coffee Mind is a small organization with few individuals and no earmarked funding, organizational or community responsibility constraints other than what we decide ourselves. So we can do whatever we find most interesting and valuable for the community. On the other hand, we have no impact other than what we, by coincidence, succeed in getting through our educational and marketing campaigns, which are not very efficient nor dominating on an international scale. This makes it easy for us to do what we want and point fingers at method and organizations that might not have the same freedom of thought as they are already committed to community and or organizational funding. So in many cases, the conservatism we criticize might be a prudent and pragmatic strategy to make only slow progress, not to tear apart relationships and organizational momentum just because somebody comes with an ideological point of view that might change the next day across the stakeholder network. So rather than hearing what is to come as a universal, valid personal criticism or specific people or organizations, look at it as an attempt to offer our voice into the mix of a global dialogue about the state of scientific methodology in the global coffee education community to support progress rather than stagnation. Suppose we are not direct and try to back it up with state-of-the-art methodology. In that case, progress is slower than if annoying people like us don't just speak up and are ready for the justified pushback from the people and organizations we are constructively critical of. Part of the reason for making this podcast is that of all the controversial findings we've had and tried to communicate, we rarely get constructive subject matter criticism, but most often we don't get any feedback at all. Still, the silence and the few comments of feedback we have gotten are more on a personal level or simply wrong counterclaims seen from a research design perspective. I've reached out personally to all the people and organizations involved with these theories, which we are skeptical about. and offered our time and resources to clarify the subject in a scientific study. Still, until now, few have wanted to collaborate. Even if people don't like us personally, maybe even for good reasons, investing in clarifying relevant research areas should supersede that kind of personal dislike for the sake of the community. So honestly, we missed the qualified dialogue that could bring the community to the next level. And there is a structure that fosters a certain kind of dynamics in the scientific tradition that we think should be the hallmark of this dialogue. This is called the evidence hierarchy. As you will see, this progressive critical approach is needed to refine the knowledge and practices in any scientific discipline and corresponding community. This system is designed to refine thoughts and claims in a dynamic, critical, but respectful dialogue in a community through the steps in the evidence hierarchy. After hearing this podcast episode, you can be part of this dialogue because you'll develop a constructively critical way of thought that helps you navigate the jungle path of experts' claims and scientific evidence. Specialty coffee education has traditionally been rooted in expert opinion formed over the last 50 years. As a scientist, it has struck me that it is often based on anecdotal evidence lacking critical scientific concept and scientific examination. The problem is not only that most of these subjects have not been through expensive scientific experiments, but rather that the fundamental concepts used in these anecdotal theories are not aligned with scientific methodology in the first place, which you can hear more about in the earlier episode of this podcast where I talk about Occam's razor, positivism, and critical rationalism, and how these classical approaches to the theory of science can help us understand why the following really widespread training focus areas are directly in conflict with scientific methodology, such as the SCA 2004 cupping form, where you are scoring quality. The second theory is the claim that the rate of rise of the bean curve during roasting is a good reference point for optimizing the flavor of a roast profile. And the third theory that we think is in directly violation of fundamental scientific principles is the training and testing of students of sensory skills training to identify individual organic acids in coffee. For a claim to be tested, it must align with fundamental research design principles, which involves formulating it using the simplest possible concept with the fewest unclear assumptions, aligned with Occam's razor. This is crucial to make it completely clear what cause and effect are investigated, which is important to define later the independent and dependent parameter in the project or theory behind it, which is explicitly required by both positivism and critical rationalism. Considering how much the community talks about science and demands it, I think it is striking how slow the collaboration between the specialty coffee business and the universities is. Slow in making explicitly relevant research projects to investigate and clarify the concepts and method used in education and the daily lives of coffee people. Having been part of establishing the research initiative in SCAE in 2013, which was before the merger of the American and European organization into SCA, it has been clear to me that the reason for the slow development is that it is driven by a blind spot in the setup with the establishment of a big organization that can only keep going by getting big money from big companies. If this is how it operates, there is little incentive to scrutinize the education system dealing with the practices and challenges of small companies and eliminate all the time-wasting concepts and practices that we, as trainers and students, spend our time with daily. Time is our most valuable non-renewable asset, and if we care for our community, we care for how we make each other spend our time. We at Coffee Mind feel that creating concepts or even leaving the community using time-wasting concepts is unethical, as it weakens the small companies from a resource perspective and hence make our community weaker. Of course, exciting research is coming out of the community and the established universities and organizations already, but I think that the above blind spot is a barrier to better and more frequent relevant research for our community. I might miss a point that focusing on big companies with big budgets and establishing a foundation will leave us better off in 20 years than the grassroots approach I have to scientific research. Over the last 16 years, we in Coffee Mind have completed more than 30 research projects fueled by our spare time and pocket money, 15 of which has resulted in scientific publications. This might not be a sustainable model to scale globally across different organizations, so I'm not trying to paint a picture of Coffee Mind as the only entity that is relevant to the research community's research. Still, I'm getting increasingly impatient with the slow progress of the propagation of the scientific method in our daily lives in the specialty coffee community. We do, however, feel a bit alone in our focus on clarifying the science behind the day-to-day problems that small companies face in their daily lives with product development and quality control on our mission to create the best educational evidence for our courses when we teach small companies. I want it to happen now, and I wonder where all the collaborators in this mission are. What does it mean to pursue the truth? What dynamics are we juggling by exploring what is the case and what is not the case? There is a quite specific way that we can look at this. Sometimes something can be the case, or it can't be the case, and we think it is the case, and we can think it is not the case. The challenge is that we can be wrong about both. We can think it is the case, and we can both be right or wrong, and we can think it's not the case, and we can also be both right or wrong. What we are striving for is to be right about the things that are actually the case, and we want to be right about the things that are actually not the case. This way of fleshing out the model of thinking in statistics along with the mathematics to investigate this outcome space was introduced formally with Neumann's paper published in 1933 with the title On the Problem of the Most Efficient Tests of Statistical Hypotheses. Formally, the situation where you think something is the case and in reality is not is named the type 1 error. And the situation where you think something is not the case and you are wrong because it actually is the case is called a type 2 error. And Neumann systematized the mathematics behind exploring the probability calculations of either type 1 and type 2 error. Most people recently have COVID-19 in mind as a great medical example. You can either have COVID-19 or not, but you can think that you have it, and you can be both right and wrong, and you can also think you don't have it, and you can also be right or wrong here. Here, a type 1 error is a false positive, and a type 2 error is a false negative. So here we want a test that gives us most true positives and true negatives, and not false positives and false negatives. Another example, anyone who has had kids know that there can either be an actual need to change the nappy or no need. However, you can think there's something only to find that it was volatiles. Well, so it smelled that, but there was nothing there, and therefore no need to actually change it, which is a type 1 error. Or you can miss that the nappy needs changing, which is a type 2 error. In case there's no smell and you think there's nothing, but there actually is something, that would be the type 2 error here, because you miss that there's something, right? In a legal system, somebody can be guilty, and it should be straightforward to ask the person if this is the case or not. But since people are not always truthful, we spend enormous amount of time and money to question people. But even despite all this effort, sometimes innocent people are prosecuted, which is a type 1 error, or guilty people go free, which is a type 2 error. Another example, either ghost exists or they don't. And if they do, and we don't acknowledge it, we are close-minded and guilty of a type 2 error. But if they don't exist and we think they do, we are superstitious. But of course, there can also be the case that you don't, and we don't believe it, in which case we are right. And we can think they exist, and they do, in which case we are also right. There is no daily life example without exploring marriage, right? So if your partner is faithful, but you don't think it is the case, you are jealous partner and you make a type 1 error. However, if you don't suspect anything and your partner is not faithful, you can miss that there's an affair going on, in which case you do make a type 2 error. And so you can see there's a lot of situations where things can be the case or not the case, and you can be right or wrong in both. So there are 4 possible outcomes in this scenario, and that is a perfect example of the situation we are dealing with dealing with statistics. An excellent example of how I think relevant research for educators and small businesses it's not reaching the community, and also is embedded in this whole problem with, is it the case or not, and is it right or wrong? So it's a perfect example of where we suspect a type 1 error, and where we also think we have evidence to show to make it the most probable conclusion. And this is our publication in March 2023 about the questionable procedure of teaching and testing students about individual organic acids in coffee tasting, which is done by the most prominent education organizations we have. Now, more than a year later, the scientific publication, the only reaction we got was some angry comments on our Instagram, claiming that students passing the exam proved the relevance of training and testing sensory skills in identifying organic acids. I can't think of a better definition of bias data to claim that students passing a test is a scientific proof. Unless all the science behind the test is clearly stated and publicly documented, and despite our making an enormous effort to gather scientific projects on this for 10 years, it is now clear to us that nothing was made at all on this subject before we published our work. I proposed to present our work at the SCA seminars at World of Coffee in Athens last year, but it was not selected for the presentation series, and the promoter of the idea and seller of the organic acids, Jose Rivera from Coffee Chemistry, says in a blog post at Barista Hustle in April 2023 about our research that showed that there's no relevance of testing organic acids from a sensory perspective in exam. He says on Barista Hustle in April 2023, and I'm quoting, "I think the study," which is our study, "was well done and comprehensive," he says. However, the biggest issue is that neither in the Q's course nor in my course, which is the Coffee Science Certificate, do we grade students on their ability to identify each individual acids. There is a blank line in the CQI and CSC test where students can write in their guess on acid, but it's not part of the final grading, he adds. And following, he says, "For me as an instructor, I find it is more important that students understand the underlying chemistry than grade their sensory abilities." All right, so he claims that it's never been the idea that you can identify organic acids, and therefore it's not even included in any exam, he says. So it was a bit surprising to find the article reprinted in the Book of Roast Volume 2 from May 2024, so that's last month as of this recording, which clearly says in the introduction in the article with the title, "Using Organic Acids as a Training Tool," and this article was originally published in Roast Magazine in July 2020. And in this article, it says in the introduction, "Without the proper training and understanding of science, a copper will not be able to understand the taste chemistry. In this article, we'll explore how to use organic acid as an additional tool to further your knowledge and fine-tune your tasting skills." In the article, the background for this practice of using organic acid as training tool, it says, and I'm quoting, "I used years of prior research to develop the module on organic acids and chemistry of coffee. This module opened a discussion and never-ending exploration of how these seemingly simple molecules play a significant role in modulating flavor and providing a foundation for a more advanced sensory training. The article then explains the difference between discriminative and descriptive sensory analysis, as if this methodology is behind the research. But no sensory data are shown in the article. And it says that it has a significant role, the molecule has a significant role, and significance can have two meanings. The first meaning is practical in the sense that it would be an obvious sensory fact for anybody tasting it. The second meaning is statistical, where you can find statistically significant differences in a group of coppers, even if the individual copper was not sure about perceiving a difference. According to our research, organic acids carry none of these possible significant differences. So even if it is only statistically significant in a group of people tasting, we would need to see the data. For around 10 years, we've been searching through scientific and publicly available information on organic acids in coffee, but we found no supporting evidence for the claims made. When we requested references to the purported years of research, as it's quoted in the article, we learned that this research is kept private because it was made for a private company, which is the company that is now the CQI as far as we understood. Scientific research should inherently be public, especially when it forms the foundation of major sensory education systems worldwide. Why keep it a secret? If I had conducted research that I profited from, both by training students and selling the required materials, I would be eager and proud to share the underlying research. This secrecy is baffling. As of this morning, I spoke with my childhood friend Nikolai, who now lives in Dubai. He noted that workers from less affluent backgrounds, such as Filipinos, often save for years to attend these courses and particularly fear the organic acid test, known for its high failure rate. No, I can't shut up about this. Research is public, education is public, and I'm just citing what is already published in magazines, articles, and blog posts. If there's anything there is no space for in science, it is secrets and conflicting public claims. So this is what we are trying to bring into the light here. Nobody from SCA or CQI has reached out to challenge us on this claim based on our scientific article, or showing data that goes against our findings and asking us to present it in any of their community channels. So I guess nobody is busy working on implementing our points from our research in the education systems. If we are right, this work could save hours, flight tickets, hotel expenses for retaking failed exams. If we are right, I don't care if we are right or wrong, as we would have benefited as much if we had found that some of the acids are above sensory threshold and some of the acids even show a difference in concentration so that they could be used as sensory identifiers. We would have been the first to document this anyway, so we would have benefited. The way we set up the test could not protect ourselves against if the panelists could detect the acids. We only wanted to know the truth. We wanted to provide evidence for whether it seems like the current trends in education is making a type 1 error, or if we, with our skepticism, were making a type 2 error. With our setup, we could test exactly this, both type 1 and type 2 errors. And with our data, it strongly indicated that the current education systems are doing a type 1 error, which is thinking there is something, even though there is not, which is a sensory relevant difference on the concentration of organic acids in different coffees. But where's the dialogue? The public truth-seeking, open and critical dialogue. And more importantly, where are the data? The public data, that is. Please meet us with criticism and data, not silence and denial. We as educators and scientists, we can't leave the global community with such contradiction claims as the quotes I just gave from Roast Magazine, Barista Hustle, and Coffee Mind scientific paper. If you want to get insight into the details of the evidence or lack hereof, please attend the seminars at World of Coffee in Copenhagen or find them on our YouTube channel and witness what it looks like to establish evidence for a scientific claim or lack thereof. Anyway, let's get into the helicopter view to make this less of a personal battle between opinions and organizations and people with these opinions, and look at what our 2,000-year-long scientific tradition offers us regarding models for how a constructive dialogue and clarification process should look like. It seemed like, for us, the most crucial step is to look at the dynamics between expert experience and observations on the one hand and scientific research process on the other. Where does it sit, and what are the positive progressive opportunities for clarification and growth in our understanding and thereby improvement of our educational system worldwide? The dynamics of scientific investigation is the evidence-based dynamic process of investigating whether a hypothesis can be supported to be neither a type 2 or type 1 error. So we believe that what we know is the case and what is not the case. Since reality and subject areas are complex, we can't just guess or reason to get the truth, but we have to compile a lot of evidence in the area and think of ways of gathering new evidence in areas not clarified yet. This is an expensive and time-consuming process, and the best platform for investigating efficiently is a community of active, curious, critical, and open people who collaborate to seek the truth. Being as efficient as possible with the resources and time, it is prudent to make sure to avail ourselves of the best practices in each area, which is the specific methods developed in each branch of science. Often people focus on the object of science, such as physics has atoms and forces, chemistry has molecules, biology has organisms, and so on. But there's a lot of sciences. But the real value of science is the methods used in these sciences to investigate the object of science, and not the objects themselves, actually. So we should focus on the methods of science rather than the objects, as it is the method that helps us navigate the jungle of type 1 and 2 errors in our exploration of reality. One of the aspects we think is a bit annoying with the new SCA coffee value assessment system is that it seems like they are a bit too eager to create a new method than they are that they can call their own, rather than just to make the already proven and available scientific methods known and used in the community. Sensory science was born in the 1970s, and microeconomics, where you distinguish between a generic product that is a physical commodity and a differentiated product where the story or extra appreciated features create value on top of the commodity value, was formulated in the 1930s. Yet with SCA, when SCA promote the CVA system, the new value assessment system, they talk about it as they are bringing recent advances in sensory science and economic to the community. And only if you count Jesus as ancient, these advances in sensory science and economic can be called recent. Because sensory science and microeconomics is almost 100 years old, at least for microeconomics, and sensory science is 50 years old. So it's not recent findings and recent trends. It's actually well-established methods that has been around for a long time. So why don't we just use them rather than trying to build something new? So it seems like they are trying to sell us a new overcomplicated system. And I think it would be more prudent to use the already available scientific sensory rapid methods, such as napping and simple consumer tests, that are meant to thrive in a non-scientific communities, but created by scientists. Why all the paper shuffling, where they try to control centrally what overcomplicated routines to use in our daily lives? I think they should spend a bit more time with Occam's razor before releasing anything to the public, and perhaps work a bit more with the statistics in the process, or with the scientists in the process, to make sure it's aligned with science and not overcomplicated. We need the broadest battery of test and investigation models, and here it would be nice to have an overview of what fundamental research design are available and what the advantages and disadvantages of the different possibilities are. This model exists, and I hereby give you the evidence hierarchy. The evidence hierarchy is a model used in research design to understand and rank the different types of research designs we know of and put them into a context so that we know the value of each and how the different types of research design can collaborate and create the best evidence based for a subject matter area, such as specialty coffee. Each step has its advantages and disadvantages, typical weaknesses and errors. So the overall hierarchy and how we as a community tap into different steps at different times is essentially. Knowing about this is the first step. So when you listen to this, you can be happy that you are among the first movers in the specialty coffee business to know what an evidence hierarchy is. The evidence hierarchy consists of the following steps. There are different versions out there, and below is a version that is adapted to the relevance of coffee science. First, we have expert experience and expert observation and opinion. So that's everything you gather as a coffee expert in your daily lives. Above that is case report, white papers, and investigative blog posts, typically made by coffee professionals as well, where you really sit down and try to think systematically about your experience and come with the best hypothesis and the best ideas. Above that is cross-sectional studies, including surveys. And above that is case control studies. Then you've got something called cohort studies, which can both be retrospective, where you're looking at data that has been created over time, or prospective studies, where you start something and observe things as they progress. Then you've got randomized controlled trials. And above that, you have systematic reviews and meta-analysis. This sounds a bit overwhelming, perhaps, but let me explain each step. You will see that each step serves a purpose that you can clearly understand and recognize from what you already heard and experienced reading community claims and scientific findings. First point, expert experience, observation, and opinions. Expert experience is based on the experiences and insights of experts in the field. It provides valuable insight into what could be an existing new area of investigation. Still, it is subjective and prone to bias, and therefore would benefit from being investigated by independent scientists who are not interested in a certain outcome but want to investigate it deeper regardless of the outcome. The typical errors are here over-reliance on personal experience or biased. You are more which is the situation where you're more interested in one outcome rather than another, because you've made a business out of a certain claim that only survives if the experiment turns out in one way and not another. And that could lead to anecdotal and ungeneralizable conclusions. It is essential to notice that this is an extremely valuable step in the hierarchy, as scientists need these observations to have anything to investigate at all. If a coffee expert goes through the hassles of writing up these observations, this coffee expert takes the observation to the next level, which is case report, white papers, and investigative blog posts. So here, detailed presentations of individual cases or a series of instances are often backed up with collected data. They can help identify new or rare phenomena without investing in expensive scientific equipment or heavy statistical data analysis, which of course limits their generalizability and does not provide the basis for hard conclusions. But it is important to mention that this kind of project, despite not being ideally collected nor analyzed based on state-of-the-art research design and statistic, provides a good and valuable insight into what could be the case and how more comprehensive analysis should focus and be designed. Because very often these observations are actually true. So it's a big help and qualification of the subject for later deeper scrutiny of the subject by scientists, for whom this is a big help in both identification of the subject but also deeply inspirational on how the final research design should be designed, as well as what it would be worth focusing on in terms of type of sample and treatment of sample and so on. So the advantages, it's cheap and quick in execution and deeply inspirational for scientists, as coffee experts are out there observing what scientists could never observe nor have an intuition about. The typical error, though, is mistaking a rare or unique case for a general phenomenon, or error in the fundamental research design, which is not applying the everything is equal principle, missing a confounding factor, mistaking a random sample variation for an actual difference, and so on. If you haven't already listened to the first Coffee Minds list of features of a good scientific theory in our podcast series that goes into the specifics of all this. So please go back and read the 8 points of a good theory, or listen to it in the first podcast episode in the science series in our podcast. The level above that is cross-sectional studies, including surveys. So observational studies that analyze already existing data from a population at a specific point in time makes this design fall into the category of retrospective research design. As it is retrospective, it is not an experiment and can only establish correlation and not causation, which is only something experiments can do. So the advantages is it's suitable for hypothesis generation, and it is easy to execute because you don't need to run a physical experiment with equipment and people. It is different from the first 2 steps in the hierarchy in that this level involves state-of-the-art data analysis in the terms of both univariate and multivariate statistics, which makes it more expensive than a case study, but less expensive than a prospective experiment that is covered later in the evidence hierarchy. Typical types of error: confusing correlation with causation. Next one is case control studies, where a cross-sectional study looks broadly at data and tries to establish interesting correlations. Observational studies focus on comparing groups with a specific focus. More precisely, case control studies attempt to group already existing data into groups with a specific condition to those without the condition. It is suitable for studying rare events and can suggest association by exploring possible causes if an experiment cannot be set up. In a case control setup, you pick the outcomes and explore conditions backwards, whereas in an experiment, you choose the conditions and monitor outcomes. Typical errors: selection and recall bias limits the ability to infer causation, which limits the type of conclusion to correlation and not causation. Next step is cohort studies, and here you can have prospective observational studies. So here you follow a group over time to see how specific factors affect the outcome. It's the most robust and more reliable than case control studies for showing association, but it is also more expensive in terms of equipment and people's time. The disadvantage of this research is that it is still vulnerable to confounding variables and does not allow for causation conclusion, but only correlation, as you can't select samples or medicine for people for specific treatment, as you only observe condition and outcomes. Only on the next step in the hierarchy will you make the critical shift from correlation to causation claims, which can only be made if you can freely choose treatment per sample or people in medicine. As you have heard thus far, there is a difference between retrospective, where you collect the data about events that have already happened, which is cheaper, and prospective, where you plan to collect data about observations that have not happened yet, which is more expensive. But this is not the link in the hierarchy that makes the difference if you are allowed to make causation claims rather than correlation claims. What makes all the difference, which allows you to make causation claims, is that you can freely choose the treatment per sample or person in medicine, and then you can eliminate possible confounding factors in the sample's environment. An excellent example from medicine that shows us how fortunate we are in coffee science is if you want to investigate if there's a relationship between lung cancer and smoking. When dealing with medical conditions, you deal with people. When you deal with people, there's an apparent ethical constraint to what you can do and can't do. So Ideally, you want to randomly allocate each participant to either the smoking group or the non-smoking group to make sure no confounder from the environment where the person came from is influencing either the tendency to smoke or the tendency to developing lung cancer. However, the ethical problem is that if you insist on allocating people randomly to the two groups, you can't avoid allocating non-smokers to the group who are forced to take up smoking, and you can't force smokers to not smoke. Still, you would face a lot of problems with the smokers you randomly allocate to the non-smoking group. How do you guarantee compliance here if you allocate smokers to the non-smokers group? So generally, in medical and financial research, where you sometimes or often can't establish a prospective randomized study, you're often limited to research design from this step in the hierarchy and below, where you can only talk about correlation and not causation, because you cannot take the people or the coffee beans out of the context from where they're coming from. You can only do that in randomized experiments. And luckily in food science, we have no ethical constraint when it comes to the random allocation of samples to different treatment groups, even though sometimes it hurts to roast some really lovely beans very dark, if they are randomly selected to be the dark example in your research. So we can freely go to the next level in the hierarchy, where we can apply state-of-the-art random allocation, which is the condition for applying the everything else equal principle, since if the allocation of beans or people is random, there can be no confounding factors transferred to the different treatment groups, and therefore each group in each group all experience the same in their prospective environment, except the deliberate experimental factors specific for the research project. So either they get the pill or no, or either they smoke or not, which is a project what you can't do. But normally in an intervention study like this, people get either a chalk pill or the real medicine. But since it's randomly allocated, the pill or the chalk pill is the only difference, because everything else is randomized out on both the control group and the experimental group. And this allows you to make causation claims and not correlation claims. It is essential to notice then, when it is often the case for medical and business sciences that they can't do prospective randomized research, they compensate by being extremely skilled in analyzing observational data. This became apparent to me when I had a few months at Copenhagen Business School at the Department of Innovation and Organizational Economics, where I might expect them to be strong in management theory, only to realize that they are primarily statisticians who can do the most advanced statistical analysis and handle massive data set in statistical software. To further strengthen their research, they are exceptionally skilled in reading literature, as when doing financial research, you can't just know the basis of atoms, chemistry, and tissues as your basis, but you must know the history of publications in social studies associated with your field of investigation. CoffeeMind's latest research paper on the dynamics of coffee roastery business models was designed and conducted with Christina Vorst Andersen, who I met at Copenhagen Business School. She is one of the most skilled researchers I've ever met, because she handles hardcore statistics in the field of vast social science literature landscape. Suppose you've dealt with the complexity of that kind of research. In that case, you are relieved when you return to coffee science, which feels a bit less complex if you know your introductory chemistry, physics, and research design. You don't have to read hundreds of articles and understand the idea of many previous researchers in the social dynamics of investigation. So again, the hierarchy does not necessarily mean that one step in the hierarchy is better than another, nor that people at one level are better than people dealing with other steps. Each step has unique value on its own, just as each step has limitations and risks. So now we get to the level called randomized control trials. Participants in medicine or food substances, so coffee beans are randomly assigned to receive different treatments in this type of research design. Therefore, this is the gold standard for establishing causation and reducing bias and confounding factors. So here you take some coffee, or in medicine some people, and split them into groups by random and treat the groups differently. You could investigate the flavor modulation of different processing methods, different fermentation times, different roast degrees, or time aspects of the roasting process, or different extraction percentages. You get my point. As mentioned earlier, in coffee science, we are lucky as we don't have any ethical barriers like they do in medicine. There are no moral considerations between choosing a single bean if it will be going through a natural or washed process, whereas as already mentioned, a medical research project looking into the health benefits of smoking, you can randomly allocate people to either smoking group or non-smoking group, as you face the moral challenges of forcing a non-smoker to smoke in each event, and a non-smoker is randomly allocated to smoke in the experiment period. Tobacco research is therefore limited to research design lower in the evidence hierarchy, where only correlation and not causation claims can be made. Sometimes the tobacco industry was not something the tobacco industry was not late to point out. Every time a doctor talked about the possible health disadvantages of tobacco, if you can separate and randomize the research object, coffee beans or people, into different groups, remove them from the conditions they used to occupy. In that case, you can't know the actual cause of the difference in outcome. There can be endless confounding factors other than smoking that cause lung cancer, socioeconomic factors, the type of house you live in, the diet, or it could even plausibly be argued that a genetic variation that simultaneously code for a strong urge to smoke and lung cancer, so that smoking as such is not the cause of developing lung cancer, but something that co-appears as an urge simultaneous with lung cancer caused by the defective gene. In this scenario, smoking habits and lung cancer co-appear if you look at retrospective data and even prospective observational studies that are not randomized. And in that kind of research design, it is impossible to establish causation, yet only correlation. A lot of economic research is faced with the same challenge, since economics deal with retrospective or prospective observational studies where randomization and the establishment of different treatment groups, like in an experiment, are logistically impossible. You can indeed conduct actual experiments in economics, such as we did in the behavioral economics study on the quality perception published in the paper Quality Does Not Sell Itself in the British Food Journal. The fact that we had the liberty to do actual randomized experiments where we can establish real and solid everything is equal situations for each experimental group in the coffee business makes irrelevant the reservations many people have against research, since they have felt let down many times by research finding in medical and economic studies where randomization, therefore the everything else equal principle, can't be applied, and hence is left with a level of correlation and conclusion and not causation. This is not the situation we are in, and we should celebrate this by not being reluctant to actual causation experiment in the coffee community. The type of error in randomized controlled trials is any conclusion in a controlled trial are strictly limited to the experiential design setup, which beans were chosen and how were they treated. Often journalists report a wrong conclusion of a study because they conclude outside the scope of the experiment, which is strictly set by the inclusion and exclusion criteria and the research design of the project. A good example is the meta-analysis by researchers at UC Davis in 2021 titled Acids in Coffee, a review of sensory measurement and meta-analysis of chemical composition. SCA made a public review article of the scientific work, link in the show notes below, in which they say in the first paragraph, knowing that acids are arguably one of the most important components in coffee, It was essentially to collect any and all information out there about acids in coffee. As if it's a fact that knowing about different acids in coffee is essential from a sensory perspective. It's a bit striking that they, in this quote, talk about it, that it seems like we know it's important, even though, as we found, there's actually nothing on that. And this is a meta-analysis where they've been looking at all the available research. So I don't think it should be assumed that it is relevant. So that's a bit weird, actually. So when reading the scientific paper, it appears that none of the coffees were brewed, as only chemical concentration in green coffee and roasted coffee were measured. Furthermore, the article focused on comparing Arabica and Robusta beans. There's hardly anything comparing acids in Arabica beans. This work is done by the Specialty Coffee Association and reported on their website. Since the Specialty Coffee Association members spend most of their time on brewed Arabica, not non-brewed Robusta is hardly relevant. One would think that it's worth mentioning that this work does not support at all the relevance of training and testing students in formic, acidic, lactic, glycolic, malic, citric, tartaric, isovaleric, and phosphoric acid, as is done by the major training systems and implicitly made relevant in the SCA flavor wheel. But sticking to the point here, this is not something you can blame the meta-analysis. In a meta-analysis, you are analyzing existing publications and the data in them. So, and you have a clear inclusion and exclusion criteria that will determine the set of papers included in the meta-analysis. Suppose none of the papers has been looking into comparing different Arabica beans and scrutinizing concentration differences and corresponding sensory properties. In that case, this is not the fault of the meta-analysis, as the methodology behind any meta-analysis is completely clear and transparent. Great methodology. So my point is that there's a confusion in the translation from the scientific article itself to the popularized version on SCA's website that misleads the conclusion and ultimately leaves out the point that nothing is said about acids in Arabica brewed and nothing is said about the relevance, if it's relevant at all, right? So they are not really talking about the type 1 error, whether it's relevant at all in Arabica, brewed Arabica. The relevance is assumed with no evidence to back it up, and you could wonder why there's not at least a critical question to this relevance in either the introduction nor the summary of the scientific article or in the popularized version on SCA's website, which then does not give a relevant and clear picture on how this meta-analysis does not support the major education systems around the world who've been wasting people's time for almost 2 decades by now. This is not a fault in the excellent meta-analysis that is probably executed to the highest scientific standards. Still, SCA should be a bit better at reflecting this into the relevance and possible wrong conclusions that could appear if the scope of the research is not scrutinized and relevant reservations on the relevance or not to the education systems. The last level, systematic reviews and meta-analysis. It systematizes data from multiple already published studies and increasingly the overall sample size, and thereby increase the overall sample size by collecting all the data from all the articles, and also gives the statistics a much higher power, which can provide a high level of evidence and provide the highest level of evidence in a subject area, which is good for summarizing research and guiding practices in the subject area, if they are carried out correctly, of course, which also is a requirement for all the other steps in the hierarchy, evidence hierarchy. The typical error of meta-analysis is that this can be limited by the quality of the included studies or by the different types of data collection and research design between studies in the article, which can be wrongly merged, garbage in, garbage out principle. From expert opinion to research question. So now we've been talking about all the different steps in the evidence hierarchy. So as is evident from what we've talked about this far, expert opinion is a crucial starting point. It sparks the well-founded initial question and hypothesis that guides scientific inquiry. However, we must subject these ideas to rigorous testing and refinement for our coffee education to evolve. And the first step is to let the claims be tested in impartial, blinded, actual experiments. However, we can freely do this in coffee as we don't have any moral barriers to an authentic randomized research design, so that we can draw actual causal conclusion, not just correlation conclusions, as in some medical and most economic research. As per my experience, there are a few barriers here. The first is often a combination of time, money, and competences to have experienced scientists participate in the research. But even if this could be found, some educators have come up with some claims that they base their business on, which makes them reluctant to have it tested. I have offered to investigate several claims for free, and few are on board. The reason I recalled the evidence hierarchy some months ago and realized how great a model it is to have a critical but positive and progressive dialogue about findings was when I saw an Instagram post by Kat Melheim, also known as Roaster Cat, who explored the sensory variation between 4 different but very similar roast profile, and I'll also link that in the show notes. I was excited to see that kind of content and appreciate all the work done to share insights that could be the basis of future scrutiny. When commenting on the Instagram post, I wanted to show my excitement as respect for the work. Still, with my scientific background, I could not just comment without also commenting about the reservations and necessity for future studies to get to the next level. The feeling of being the person who criticizes such finding for not being scientific, combined with my urge to show my excitement, I had a feeling that I could formulate my excitement better and also leave a space for my thoughts on the next step without sounding like an old grumpy scientist. It struck me that the evidence hierarchy that I learned about when teaching medical statistics many years ago at the university is precisely the model we can use for coffee professionals to freely publish their observations to the benefit of the community and pride themselves on contributing to the essential and qualified second step in the evidence hierarchy, namely the level of case report, white paper, and investigative blog posts. Expert observations are important and valuable, as you can't just come up with something exciting or qualified without much experience and hard work. If the work is not starting here and getting tracked by being published and discussed in the community, how would we ever get the funding to make an experiment or some of the more expensive steps in the evidence hierarchy? Also, I've reached out to several educators with exotic theories that I disagree with, and leaving the possibility open that I'm wrong, I've suggested investing in the investigation of the claims using a blinded and randomized research design where only nature can provide the conclusion. Few are willing even to collaborate, which makes me, even if I'm actually wrong, more suspicious that the claims are biased and or confounded and therefore might be a waste of everybody's time. The only way we as an educator community can serve the busy and hardworking specialty coffee community is to let our theories and claims be scrutinized at different levels of the evidence hierarchy, giving us all more insights into what is the case and what is just a good story. A type 1 error. As is also evident from the exploration of each step in the evidence hierarchy is this podcast episode, no one study is comprehensive enough or necessarily bulletproof, so each article should be taken with a grain of salt. And the scope, which is determined by the inclusion and exclusion criteria for sample selection, as well as the research design and statistical data, could very well be more limited than you would think from just reading the article and the abstract, or even worse, reading about the scientific article in a magazine or online review article where journalists have failed to stay inside the scope of what is said and what is not said in the original work. Sometimes journalists are spot on and really convey it well, and sometimes they don't at all. This is where it would be great if you went to the source itself and made up your mind. You could try grabbing the UC Davis meta-analysis and see how excellent it is executed from a scientific point of view. Link in the show notes again. But also keep in mind if it informs you at all whether it is relevant and test students in differentiation and identifying formic, acidic, lactic, glycolic, malic, citric, tartaric, isolated valeric, and phosphoric acid in an exam situation. This way you'll get my point firsthand and don't have to take my word on it. The point that no research design is perfect nor necessarily correctly conducted, as I have indicated in each step with the risk of limitations on each step in the hierarchy, is not a good argument for not trying to get claims used in our education system on the steps in the hierarchy. For claims to be well established, the data behind them needs to be public and made in setups where personal incentive can affect the outcome. So blinded and randomized settings conducted by a researcher who has no incentive in a particular outcome, and preferably scrutinized at different steps in the hierarchy so that more aspects of the claim has been shed to light. Research needs to be public, and the repetition of the outcome in a different laboratory is a good thing, as this shows that the result of the first research project was not just a coincidence or a confounding error in the setup, even for randomized trials. Still, indeed, an objective truth in the sense that the phenomena investigated will show itself regardless of who executes the experiments. When we did the first organic acid project at the University of Copenhagen, we found that the low acidity Brazilian pulp natural coffee had double the amount of the dominant citric acid compared to the highly acidic Kenyan coffee that we had in the project, which made me dismiss the result as a label error. I felt that we did not find anything and nothing was published because it didn't make sense that the low acidic Brazilian had double the amount of citric acid compared to the high perceived acidity Kenyan coffee. But after talking to Samus Merkle from ZHV, who had seen similar data, we started to suspect that the student did not make a label error, and we found the courage to invest more time and more money in another investigation. We did this at another university using different equipment, and this time it was conducted by scientists and not students from the University of Southern Denmark. When we found the same data with different group of people on different equipment, we trusted that the first project was neither a coincidence nor a confounding factor, nor a label error. Can you see how even randomized controlled trials cannot necessarily be trusted in themselves for many reasons? Which is why a few projects looking at the same or similar object with identical or similar questions and identical or similar research design, or even different research design, and preferably by different groups of researchers on different universities, are needed before certainty in a subject starts to dawn on the community. If a claim is stuck on the expert experience level, it is not scrutinized, and there is a high risk if we base too much of our education system on claims stuck at this potentially high bias level. I have specified each weakness and risk per step in the evidence hierarchy, but there is a risk that permeates all levels, which is fundamental to the peer review system and is worth mentioning as a last things. In scientific publications, a system is in place to increase the probability that the published work is at the highest international level. The way it works is that peers are chosen based on being the experts in the field, based on the history of publication and the impact of their published work in general. As a publishing scientist, I'm often invited as a reviewer on scientific papers about coffee roasting and sensory evaluation, which is great fun. I'm also on the other end of that stick when I'm publishing research with my research buddies. As the peer review process is the last stand for keeping the quality of the published research at the highest level, peers are expected to be as critical as humanly possible. When I get a review, I often feel inadequate and annoyed because I think they are overly critical and they don't even see the value of the research. But never have I been part of such a process without the fierce critique by peers, and it subsequently has improved the quality of the research and the paper manifold. So it is an extremely valuable process for the quality that goes through. I have even had work plainly rejected to my immense disappointment and annoyance, but reluctantly agreed and went back to the drawing board and remade the project and added more data and ended up appreciating the rejection because it made the next version of the research and paper even better. However, this process is not without possible errors, and sometimes multidisciplinary projects have blind spots for peers, which often happens in research project that combines chemical and sensory data. As sensory science is still not understood broadly in the scientific community, and least at all by chemists, those projects end up in papers with peers with a chemistry background who do not take sensory science seriously, nor understand the fundamental research design in sensory science, which makes them accept the 2004 SCA copying protocol to be a protocol that can be used in scientific projects. I think if not enough is said about that protocol and the complete lack of appropriateness from a scientific point of view. Please listen to the earlier podcast episode of this subject and get a deep understanding of why I would say this. And it goes without stating that if I, as a reviewer, gets a paper that investigates different physical and or chemical aspects of coffee using the SCA 2004 protocol as a measure of sensory data as an endpoint, I tell them to take out the sensory data and see if they still have a story to publish. And if they don't, I think there's nothing to publish. I feel a strong responsibility for the community because if it is published in a respected peer review paper, the community will be even more confused, run with the wrong conclusion, or waste even more precious time. I have seen several scientific papers using the 2004 SCA copying protocol, and I think none should have been published. Recently, in 2022, a paper was published on the influence of jute bag versus Grain Pro on the sensory properties of coffee. Even though the majority of the article is about chemical aspects of coffees, the sensory data is published as if the quality data should be taken seriously. And in the months following the publication, I heard people referencing it as the latest news about the different materials affected the quality of the coffees. This is an example of the many cases where the peer review process fails the community. So as you see, there's no safe space here. We need to understand all the claims, get an idea of the quality of each study, and see how many different studies there have been on the subject. Reading the article yourself and keeping my 8 points of a good theory in mind, please listen to that podcast if you haven't already, as well as skepticism of flawed sensory methodology, such as the 2004 SCA protocol, is a good starting point. The next step would be to look for the reference list on the research paper to get an idea of how much research there has been on the field already and how well the evidence hierarchy is populated with this research subject. If there's hardly anything, there's little evidence that this has been scrutinized by the public global research community, and perhaps the subject is stuck at the expert level, which is a good start, but not a reason to include it in global education systems. I think SCA is too slow with progress in this area, and that much of the research done is done with a financial bias towards the bigger industrial companies who can afford to invest in research, which is a good case of what is called publication bias. And unfortunately, this construction in research funding leaves the education system to the small businesses worldwide in the blind spot of this construction. And for this reason, progress is really slow. Expert experience, observation, and opinions. Insight from experienced professional offers valuable starting points for research, but can be subject and biased. They need further scientific testing to validate, but is a great fast and inexpensive starting point, often based on extensive expert experience. So this is really important to understand as coffee professionals, that you can really add a lot of value to the community by sharing your experience. So my personal motivation and passion are related to the worry and annoyance that it seems like our community is not an ideal situation to know what is the case and what is not the case. And there are too many type 1 errors flooding our education system because people have been more engaged in making good stories for marketing purposes than making sure that what they said was actually correct. This is why I feel our education systems and associated research institution has a separate responsibility. But having been part of the formation of SCAE's research initiative in 2013, been in the research committee, education committee, and curriculum creators group before and during the merger of SCAE and SCAA, I've been shocked by how little space the truth is given in processes where organization, universities and influencers where people are happy to with type 1 errors as long as it does not hinder their income or power ambitions. I too am selling products and striving for influence, but I can't see why I would have to bend reality in that ambition, as I think science is a great way for companies like my own and communities to not waste their time. I think that we have enough challenges and opportunities even without bending reality, and honestly do what we can to neither make type 1 nor type 2 errors in that pursuit. I think too many are doing their marketing as if they were speed dating for a quickie. I think we as a community should market and sell to each other more like long-term relationships, where we must be curious about our own type 1 and 2 errors to stand as firm as possible on common ground, where bias would be a destabilizing factor, making the relationship and our community weaker. Doing this honest, open, critical, but progressive communication is best, and this would naturally harvest interesting observation from the expert level over time. Collaborating with scientific community would populate the evidence hierarchy to give us the best evidence in the area. But we need to get started and get all the claims into the light so that we can start to take away bias caused by type 1 and type 2 errors, and then disseminate this to the education system so as not to waste the time of people entering our community. I'm impatient and I feel we are far away from being here. And I don't see the big organization working on this at the speed I think is possible. To come back to the areas where we are critical about mentioning at the beginning of the podcast episode, we feel that we need to clarify if it is relevant or not, even teach, train and test students in the identification of organic acids, which we think all evidence, including our own points towards it is not. Another thing is the rate of rise theory needs to be formulated differently, as right now it is formulated more like a correlation observation by experts, and in order to investigate this further, it needs to be formulated differently so that it is clear what the independent and dependent variables would be before the theory can enter higher levels of experiential designs rather than the anecdotal correlative observation styles it is formulated as now. The SCA 2004 quality-oriented copying needs to just go away, and the new copying form should be much simpler and clearer. If you are not totally sure where you're going and how, the probability of getting there is low. We can't have overcomplicated method promoted by our own institutions. All of this would be exposed and corrected naturally and automatically if only we as a community had a habit and a process in place to purify our claims through a well-functioning collaboration between companies and research institutions through the evidence hierarchy. If you found this episode interesting, you can attend a free seminar at World of Coffee in Copenhagen or find the recorded seminars on YouTube, where we will dig deeper into the actual evidence of several topics where you can see the thoughts in this podcast in action. Hope to see you soon.